The war in Syria is reported to have claimed the lives of 2 British jihadists this week. They'd apparently gone to the country to join Islamic State. There are thought to be about 500 British men there. About 200 have already come back, and that raises concerns that they'll continue their fight here. Well, the government is planning increased security measures, including banning suspected extremists from re-entering the UK for 2 years or more, and tougher monitoring if they're allowed back in. Well, the Home Secretary, Theresa May, has been talking about the terrorist threat facing Britain on the Andrew Marr Show.
Well, I think what we've seen happening in relation to the threat over recent months, and Andrew, and indeed in the last few years, is that the threat has become more diverse. So there was a time when people were looking at perhaps just Al-Qaeda-related threats, Al-Qaeda-related threats that were long time in the planning. Now the threat is more diverse in terms of the number of groups out there who will be looking to carry out attacks in the West. It's also more diverse in that not everybody's affiliated to a particular group. Some are self-starting groups. And then you do have individuals, perhaps the lone wolves or the volatile individuals. So we have to look across the board at all sorts of threats that are out there.
Theresa May, the Home Secretary, speaking on the Andrew Marr Show this morning. Let's speak now to our guests here, and we're joined by Douglas Murray, who's from the Henry Jackson Society. So I'd like to start with you, Douglas. What do you think should happen to returning British jihadists?
Well, there's no single answer to that problem, and it's a problem which, by the way, it's worth mentioning, is not academic. The last time I was on this programme, I think probably the last time Miriam was on this programme, we were joined by a young man called Abu Rumeza, well-known extremist around Britain, well-known for his extremist connections. He talked about how wonderful he thought the Islamic State was then. Some of us said, well, in that case, why don't you go and join them? In fact, 2 weeks ago he did, and he took his young family with him. So this is something that is happening. It's something that's going to be a problem for a long time. The reason why I say there's no single answer to it is that there are obviously going to be people who go and who are killed there, as reportedly 2 people were from Britain this week. There will be others who will want to stay there. There will be some who want to come back. And in all of that, a country like Britain has a complex set of challenges. I think the most desirable thing would be that people who have participated in very, very bloodthirsty massacres do not ever return to the UK. Either they're killed in fighting, or for some other reason they don't come back. But if they do come back, we have to work out a policy of what to do with them. Now, some people say, why don't you try them? Why don't you put them on trial? In many of these cases, we won't know exactly what people have done. It's not possible for the Metropolitan Police to go out to the Syrian war zones and speak to people and gather testimony in the way they would if a crime had taken place in Britain.
Listen in as Douglas Murray goes head-to-head with leftists and schools them at their own game. Here he is taking on one of the most important questions facing Western societies today. Are mainstream Islam and Islamic terrorism inextricably linked? And if so, what can we do to tackle the problem? To answer this, Douglas zeroes in on the terrifying phenomenon of Islamic State, otherwise known as ISIS, which captured a large part of the Middle East, committing mass murder, torture, and rape in the process.
Known killer presiding over the beheadings of Americans James Foley and other Western hostages. He may have killed some himself, and with each video, he's trash-talked his enemies.
Obama.
Their aim? To create a new Islamic empire that will ultimately take over the world and convert everyone to Islam. Their justification? The Quran, which states that there can never be peace until everything is submitted to Allah. In other words, the same holy book that every mainstream Muslim follows. Muslims from around the world, including Britain, heeded Islamic State's call to wage holy war. After committing atrocities abroad, many of these terrorists sought to return to the UK. What to do with them? Douglas gives us the answer.
So there are a set of challenges, and what is happening at the moment is the Home Secretary and the government are trying to work out which of the range of tools available to them are most effective.
But you say prosecution isn't the answer.
I'm saying it might be the answer in some cases. If you've got evidence, if you've got suitable witnesses, if you've got a level of evidence suitable to be bringing somebody to trial, then it's an answer, but it's not the single answer on its own.
Stop them from coming in the first place?
Stop
if they're
them,
returning home?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Stop them coming in if you can.
Miriam?
stop them from coming back before the next election so that they're not a problem? No, I mean, I think we have, I think actually a multi-pronged approach is obviously the answer. The question is how we define even the term jihadi here. If we know that there are individuals that have been involved in war crimes, which is how the UN defines some of the actions committed by individuals in ISIS, then we should be pushing for them to be prosecuted, without a doubt. What the Danes have been pushing is this model for rehabilitation for so-called jihadis, but I think it's been often misrepresented because the individuals that they're targeting primarily with the rehabilitation are individuals who went out, may not actually have ended up involved in frontline action, have become disillusioned with what they thought they were going out to do, which was either help Syrians or join some sort of utopian state, and have come back and actually want to reintegrate society.
So they're given further education and they're given jobs as well in Denmark. And Denmark claims that this has been effective in terms of de-radicalisation. And is that the answer here? That if people want to come back, that they've left to go to Syria to fight or Iraq, and they say they want to return to their country of birth, they're allowed back in. Would you de-radicalise them with education and jobs?
Rehabilitation is a great ideal, of course it is, and it, maybe what we should aspire to, but it is very expensive and it isn't always effective, and it takes 30 people. If you decide on surveillance, that takes 30 officers to watch one person. How practical is this? I think a principle, something that, whatever you think about UKIP, the recent, the growth of UKIP shows that people in this country feel that it should be a privilege to be here. It's not automatic that people should necessarily be allowed in, and I think that is a very good principle. I mean, I thought it was extraordinary, for instance, I don't know all the facts, but that Ronnie Biggs was allowed back here. The expense of looking after him when he had turned his back on this country. Why didn't we say, sorry mate, it's too bad?
So you wouldn't let them back in?
Well,
if returning jihadists said...
It is complicated because, I mean, legally it's complicated, and this is something the government is looking at. If somebody has British citizenship, is it actually legal to stop him or her coming back in? But my first principle would be it is a privilege to be here, and you have to earn that right.
Well, it's not necessarily a privilege if you've ended up here because your parents were here because of colonialism or an empire. I mean, you're here because of history.
But it's still a privilege.
Well, yes and no.
I think it's a privilege to be British and to live here, and I think we should have that principle. And I mean, being absolutely brutally honest about it, why should we pay? Why should we pay to imprison somebody who has turned his back on this country? So I'm not saying that that's a simplistic answer. Of course, you're absolutely right. And it may have to be a case-by-case basis. And if somebody goes abroad at the age of 17 and wants to come back at 18, saying, "Golly, what knows what I'm doing," and has a family here, of course, that's very different.
Well, this is it. You don't know whether they're misinformed idealists. They're 17, 18-year-olds. Alan, not everyone who left to involve themselves in the war in Syria were looking to side themselves with the terrorist groups, and that's where it all gets a bit mucky and vague, because who knows what they got up to when they were out there.
It is mucky and vague. It's a very mucky and vague war. I mean, there were people who went out to fight against Assad, as they saw it, and who have ended up with groups like ISIS. But people make choices in their lives, and people make mistakes, and people at some level have to pay for mistakes.
As Douglas correctly states, if a citizen of a Western country sides with a terrorist organization that seeks the destruction of the West and commits atrocities to that end, that citizen should never return. Around 1,500 British Muslims went off to fight for Islamic State, twice the number that serve in the British Armed Forces. A truly shocking statistic that brings into serious doubt the loyalty of many Muslims to the Western countries of which they are citizens. Being a citizen of a country doesn't automatically signal loyalty, merely a preference for a particular material quality of life. Anyone who supports and fights for a hostile force should rightly be considered an enemy of the state. They have committed the worst crime possible, high treason, which up until 1998 was punishable by the death in the UK. Simply letting them back in isn't an option that should ever be considered, as Douglas explains.
And you want to come in?
It's a bit strange being a privilege being British. I happen to be born in Britain, I don't think it's a privilege being black or anything like that. I just happen to be born like that, but I think that's not the important thing here. The important thing is these young people that go abroad to fight in these campaigns, many of them are misled. I was speaking to a mother the other day that told me that her son went and she hasn't seen him and hasn't heard from him since she's been there. The first thing I said to him, oh, he's been indoctrinated by jihadists. And she said, no. She was listening to Cameron saying you've got to rise up against Assad. I mean, he was inspired by our government when they were voting. And
so he went out to Syria to fight against Assad?
Yes.
Is what his mum's saying?
Yes. And then he got involved in...
If I can say so, I mean, it does sound like a bit of an excuse. I mean, I don't think there are many radical young men in this country waiting to take direction from David Cameron.
Well, it's not so much taking direction, but there was a
the point is that you can go for one reason and end up being sucked into
and there's a complexity. There's undoubtedly a complexity which some jihadists I've spoken to as well say comes from the fact that this government initially was for regime change and then backed down.
Miriam.
Douglas is quite right. As Western countries, we have to abide by the rule of law. This is what separates us from unfree, despotic countries, the kind that Islamic State seeks to establish. If individuals have visited areas in which atrocities have taken place, and they are not journalists or aid workers, the only conclusion can be that they have participated in said atrocities. However, owing to the lawless and anarchic nature of such areas, there is unlikely to be any definitive evidence of their crimes. What are we to do then? Let the suspects back in to live their life as before, potentially plotting terrorist activities on our own soil?
Languages. Experts say no terror group has ever had a propaganda machine as sophisticated and dangerous.
No. As Douglas says, the only way to protect our countries is to outright prevent such individuals from returning. They can seek citizenship in a country more sympathetic to their fundamentalist worldview. Of course, as per usual, the leftists on the panel are quick to accuse Douglas of racism, as we see in the next clip.
I just wanted to come back on the idea that this is a very expensive policy. I mean, the Danes made a very interesting statement, one of the men from the security services. He said, we don't do this because we're nice people. We do it because it's effective. The point is we do it because it's the most effective way of protecting our citizens.
But it isn't always effective.
But it is considered one of the most cheapest methods available
but the figures
also for dealing.
The figures from Denmark, though, Anne, are that they said that last year 31 people went out to fight in Syria, and this year it's 1. And they think that it's down to their policy of de-radicalisation.
And one of the questions we keep asking ourselves is why are these young people being radicalised? And the best way of getting that information is from the people themselves.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes,
but it is also really a privileged position to stand here and say that there are citizens in this country by virtue of their ethnic origin who can have their citizenship withdrawn from them. It is
there is something.
It's nothing to do with ethnic origin.
It is a racialised conception of citizenship that says that you can take away people's citizenship.
No, that is completely
their origins are not native.
That is completely unacceptable. We're talking about behaviour.
Can I ask Miriam? Just before we all chip in, Miriam, why do you say that it's there's a racial aspect to taking away somebody's citizenship if they're suspected to be an Islamic extremist?
Because where are you supposedly sending them back to? Let's take the most recent case of a young man who is who's of Vietnamese origin but who is a British citizen.
This is the one going through the Supreme Court.
Absolutely, he's going through the Supreme Court at the moment. Britain wants to take away his citizenship. Vietnam says he's got nothing to do with us. He's not a Vietnamese citizen as far as they're concerned. The only reason that we can consider taking away his citizenship is because we do not regard him as fully British. And that is a racialised conception of citizenship.
If I could just correct that.
Correct me, would you?
The problem about what Miriam's just said, among other things, is you can do the thought experiment another way. Let's say a pseudo-state was set up in another country in the world.
It's not a state.
I know it's not a state. You know it's not a state. They think they're a state. They call themselves a state. And a lot of people who burn their passports or go over to fight for them believe they are a state. Let's pretend another pseudo-state was set up from any other religious or other kind of background. If people from Britain were going to that state of any background or any origin and they were cutting off people's heads and raping women and children and so on, I think this country would take a rather tough stance about it. And I think, among other things, one of the things we would look at was withdrawal of passports, among other things. If you say you are signed up to this appalling state, then maybe we take you at your word.
Accusing someone of racism when they're trying to deal with very complicated, nuanced issues is a cheap tactic, one that preys on any normal person's abhorrence of discriminating against others based on race. Luckily, Douglas isn't sidetracked and launches into a well-reasoned argument to the contrary. Taking a firm stance on terrorists has nothing to do with race. It doesn't matter if the terrorist is white, black, or Asian. What matters is the crimes they've carried out.
Now London. Muslim communities thrust into the spotlight and not for anything good. Soon after the attack, this picture appeared on Twitter.
The last person accused of treason in the UK and sentenced to death was William Joyce, a white man who aided and abetted the Nazi regime during the Second World War. The state has the right to protect itself against any individual who has committed atrocities and is likely to continue doing so, no matter what his or her race is. But the question still remains: to what extent is the ideology of Islamic State a logical extension of Islam? Douglas weighs in.
Miriam's cases, there is a racial element.
But there should not ever be. And I think something Miriam said that we really must come back on is that somebody is not considered fully British.
Absolutely.
You are either British or you're not.
Well, then you can't withdraw somebody's citizenship. They're British citizens that we have to deal with.
If I can say so, not only has it not got anything to do with race, but the bit that Miriam has not mentioned, which it has a very great deal to do with, is religion. This has a great deal to do with religion, and we have not so far discussed the religious aspect of this, because Islamic State calls itself Islamic State for a reason. They follow certain principles, misguided in your opinion, misguided in my opinion, but certain principles that they say they derive from Islam.
All right,
and any discussion of this has to take them at their word to some extent.
Douglas is spot on here. As soon as anyone even remotely connected to Christianity commits a crime, the leftist media immediately focuses in on the religious aspect as a way to tar and undermine Christianity. Conversely, if a Muslim commits a crime, they do their absolute best to whitewash any kind of religious motivation, even when the criminal explicitly says that they're acting in the name of their faith.
People won't disrespect Islam. Nobody will disrespect it because they're scared. Even in a Christian country.
What do you mean by disrespect?
I mean, disrespect it. Say something, disrespect it. You can walk around, if you could wear a t-shirt saying Jesus is gay, right here in Croatia, a Christian country, and you will make it out of the country alive. I dare you to do the same thing with the Islamic Prophet.
However, the idea that Islamic fundamentalism is merely a cult split off from mainstream Islam is just burying one's head in the sand. A poll carried out in the UK in the wake of the London terrorist attack of 2005, in which close to 70 people were murdered, found that 1 in 4 Muslims believe the attack was justified. No Christian would ever attempt to justify the crimes of the Catholic Church, say, or the behavior of David Koresh. This kind of cover-up by the left prevents us from being able to debate the reality of the situation and come up with possible solutions, as Douglas brilliantly highlights next.
Well, I mean, I think it's very interesting that we would sort of try and essentialize Islamic State. They're very much like any cult, or if you like, I think you can
look at their origins.
If you compare them to any sort of cult or gang, there are usually some similarities with the broader concept from which they're derived. So you get cults that are derived from Christianity. Sure. Very similarly, you would say that Daesh or Islamic State is derived from Islam in some way. Yeah. But I think the problem is to take things at face value and to certainly to corroborate their narrative by accepting their view that it is a state and that they have the legitimacy to call themselves Islamic. It's problematic.
The Waco group in Waco some years ago, everyone was interested in the religious claims they were making when they decided to become this millenarium crazy cult. If I can just finish. Yeah. This is a crucial thing we cannot avoid. I know it's uncomfortable. I know we want to keep avoiding it. But the religious aspect, which Miriam didn't want to talk about, is a vital part of this discussion. And it's reliant upon Muslims of all kinds to take that on and tackle it. If I thought it was vital, Douglas,
I absolutely would bring it back. But I think what's important is when you look at, for example, these rehabilitation programs, because that's what we're talking about here, is how to deal most effectively with the threat, is that we are talking about using methods that have been shown to be effective in other contexts and with other groups.
Yeah, and those are,
can I just finish? They are methods that have been used in criminology and criminal studies for decades, and they've got nothing to do with Islam. They just happen to be effective.
But ISIS does have a lot to do with Islam.
We're going to have to let you finish this outside, I'm afraid, because that's all we have time for in this section of the programme. Thank you very much.
The leftist Muslim apologist may protest wildly, but Douglas is correct. We desperately need to understand why so many Muslims in Western societies are turning to fundamentalist readings of their religion. Only then can we take action to prevent it and move in a direction in which our societies are expunged of this threat for good. The longer leftists refuse to have this conversation, not only does our way of life become more endangered, but our actual lives do too. If you enjoyed this look into the mind of Douglas Murray, please hit the like button. Give us your thoughts on the issues discussed in this video in the comments. And for more Murray content coming soon, don't forget to subscribe.